Now let us take a closer look at how these Anglo-Saxons lived. Construction of this village, called Stowa, first began around 420 AD, about 10 years after the Romans pulled out of Britain. Stowa is located in central Britain, only about 30 miles from the North Sea. And by the time the Anglo-Saxons arrived here, this land had already been under cultivation by the Romans for several centuries. Stowa, like other Anglo-Saxon communities, was basically self-sufficient for most things, from food to clothing to household goods. For in the earliest days of their occupation of Britain, the Anglo-Saxons did not engage in the high level of trade that had centered in Roman towns and markets. And the same held true of religion, for the Anglo-Saxons followed the Old Norse gods and had little knowledge of either the pagan Roman religion or Christianity. Stowa was a typical 5th century Anglo-Saxon community and was home to 3 or 4 different family groups, which included not just parents and their children, but could also include grandparents and great-grandparents as well. Within the village boundaries, each family group occupied its own mini-village, consisting of 5 or 6 buildings. These buildings were always roofed with a thatch of straw or reeds to keep out the rain. The walls were made either of wooden planks or woven branches and mud, called daub and wattle. And this technique of weaving branches also was put into use in creating baskets for storing grains and wool. This building, called the hall, was the focal point of activity for the whole village, and here a fire was always kept burning, both for warmth and to cook food. The hall tended to be a pretty smoky place, for it had no chimney, so the smoke simply filtered up through the thatched roof into the outside air. Families gathered together here in the evenings, or during bad weather, to relax, share their evening meal, and the day's gossip. The outbuildings served many functions. Some were used for sleeping. Others served as workshops for various crafts, such as making shoes from leather, or making pots, jugs, cups, and other containers from clay. But the main activity of the village of Stowa was farming. Wheat, barley, and peas were raised, and these crops provided the vast majority of food for the village. Cows were also kept for the meat, milk, and leather they yielded. Sheep were also raised, and transforming their raw wool into cloth was another very important village activity. Much of the year, cloth-making was an indoor activity, but during times of good weather, the cloth-making procedures moved outside. Women would prepare special plant materials for dye-making, and once the wool had been dyed, the next step was to spin it into thread using a spindle. Spinning was a time-consuming activity, but must have been a great relief from the back-breaking work of the fields. After the wool had been spun into thread, villagers often set up their looms on the outside wall of a house, and thus could enjoy the fresh air and sunshine while weaving the thread into warm woolen cloth. Besides making items of cloth, leather, and clay for use in the village, objects of turned wood were also created on these simple machines known as pole lathes. Foot power and the natural spring of a large wooden pole was all that was needed to turn the pieces of wood so they could be shaped into useful objects by a chisel.